Welcome back. We're coming into leadership principle number 3, and that is a leader uses good judgment. This is where we left off in our last session. Now, let's return to the book of Acts in chapter 27, and let's go back to verses 9 through 12. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they can reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now, this principle that we're working with here, which is where we left off in our last session, is talking about that a leader uses good judgment. A leader uses good judgment. Now, if you recall, they were at the island of Crete. And if you recall, they came to Salmone, which is about, if you took this pulpit area and made it an island, okay, and straight across in the easterly direction would be Rome, okay, Italy, and that's where they want to go to, but they can't get there because of all the headwinds and all the storms and the tempest that has risen up. So they come down from Rhodes, they come down from another island right up here, which is Rhodes, coming off of the main coast of Asia Minor, and they come down, and they're going to try to swing around this thing. They come to Salmone. They come here, okay, but the island is a small island. The winds are coming over this island, and when they come down, they're gushing at an even higher speed. So the rate of speed is increasing, and the force gale winds are picking up now. They've got to negotiate from Salmone on this side of the island all the way to this side, okay, to Fair Havens. That's approximately about 140 miles. When they get here, they got to try to make their way up. Okay, now they're going to try to make their way up to the port of Phoenix. This is what they want to get to. Okay? This is what they're going to try to get to. However, the conditions are worsening. Now, it's not just that they're worsening by the day, it's now worsening by the hour. We just read the scripture, and what we find here is that the captain and the pilot, the centurion, and all the people with the titles of leadership ignore the words of Paul. And then it says that they got together, basically, and they made a collective decision. And so what we have here is the mob rule. What we have here is the majority ruling, and usually that does not turn out well. So according to the world's view, a leader is a risk taker according to the world's view. He is a dice roller. Leaders are often called upon to take a certain amount of legitimate, calculated risk. However, a good leader never makes a decision that is a pure gamble. That just does not take place if you're a good leader. Wise leaders don't wager with their people. You don't put your people at risk. They don't subject their people to unnecessary hazards. Right? Paul's advice was good judgment. But by spurning it, the crew and the soldiers were gambling with everyone's lives. They just categorically, just ignored everything that Paul had to say. They were literally casting their fate to the wind. That's literally what they were doing. Trusting blind luck that everything would turn out okay. And let me tell you something, that simply is not wise leadership. That is foolishness. And way too many of us in the ministry, there is just too many of us in the ministry. That's exactly how we lead our churches. Trusting good luck and throwing ourselves out to the headwinds. Now, I often tell young pastors that the fastest way to lose people's trust is not by preaching a bad sermon. Let me tell you something. People will forgive you for that. They understand that you are still honing in your craft, your skills, your ability to deliver a message. They got that part. They understand that part. However, the fastest way to lose credibility as a leader is to make a foolish decision that leads people down a blind alley or off the end of a pier. This is exactly why a lot of young preachers, who come into a new pastorate, or they come into an existing pastorate, let me put it this way for you, and the church has already been there for a while, it's already been established, and they come in, they make wholesale changes without consulting with anybody, without praying through anything, okay? And this is where immediately they've set up a battleground. Too many young men in the ministry make impetus and ill-considered decisions. They just do it. Okay? They lead without looking where they're going. That happens way too often. They don't count the cost of their decisions. They just simply don't do it, and they aren't cautious enough. Now, you might think that young leaders would make mistake of being too timid. You might think that. But my experience has been that that is not necessarily true. Okay? But in my experience, it's much more common for young men to fail. Why? Because they are impetuous. Okay? They're impetuous. They're highly impetuous. They are insensitive. They don't seek wise counsel. They know everything, and everybody else around them doesn't know anything. And when you're highly impetuous, let me tell you something, you will lead, a situation that was already bad into a disastrous state if you're not careful. Good leaders are analytical. Let me tell you something. That does not mean that you come into a closet where you have all this analysis and then it becomes paralysis. That's not what I'm talking about, where you're incapable of making decisions. What I'm talking about is that you have analyzed everything. You've looked at all of your options. You're back to that 38,000 foot level, and you're looking at the bigger picture and looking at the possible outcome and circumstances of all of the possible options that lay before you. See, they understand when there's a calculated risk, but they carefully assess the risk and plan for contingencies. You've got to have some contingent plans. You need to, because we're in a people business and people are fickle. Okay? You can't trust all of them at all times. If disaster is looming and there's no way out, they don't press ahead. Then don't press ahead. Let me tell you something. You're going to have to look at some other options, and sometimes those options are not what people want. Much was in jeopardy on this ship. A lot was in jeopardy with this decision to sail ahead. They just trusted their luck to the wind. They threw themselves out to the wind. The cargo ship and the lives of all aboard could be lost. That was a very strong possibility. And given the conditions that existed, with the high winds and the sea and the sea and waves picking up even more, now at this point they literally are throwing out all caution to the wind. And that was precisely how Paul outlined the danger. Go back to verse 10. Acts 27:10. And he said to the men, I perceive, this is Paul speaking, that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. They didn't even consider one word, not one syllable, not one letter of anything he had to say. You remember what the centurion said, right? Look at verse 11. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot, the captain of the ship, than what was being said by Paul. That's it. He didn't even take into the possibility that Paul might be right. All of them wanted to get moving. That's all they wanted to do. After all, why listen to Paul? Right? Think about it. Why bother even to listen to him? I mean, what does he have to say to us? What did he know about sailing the Mediterranean on a vessel, like this one, as big as this? Thus, the whole voice of wisdom was absolutely silent. What they did not understand was that he had already been on 3 ships and all 3 sunk. He understood what he was talking about. They didn't even bother to ask, why do you say what you say? They worked out a solution among themselves. It was only a relatively short distance. They had worked this out in their head. Only about 40 miles around the western end of Crete to Phoenix. I think we can make this. It's only 40 miles. Do you understand what 40 miles is in a storm? Phoenix was a better port than Fairhavens, and it had a semicircular harbor with openings on the southwest and northwest. and it was more protected against the harsh winter winds. That was all true. The question was, can you make it? Perhaps they could at least get that far and then decide whether to stay the winter or move on. Remember our whole conversation in our last session. So at the first wind seemed favorable. That was the illusion. So now we just read verse 10. We read verse 11. Now drop down to verse 13. Acts 27:13. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing, notice this, that they had attained their purpose, they go, oh, we made the right decision. They weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. Okay? They weren't all that dumb. They were not that smart, but they weren't all that dumb. So they tried to stay as close as possible to shore. Okay? But remember, these vicious winds are coming over the island. And when they're coming over this island, okay, what's happening? It's hitting the ship. And so this ship slowly begins to peer off the shoreline, and it's moving out slower and slower, and it's pushing them, okay? Now it's going to push them into a southwest direction, which is not a good thing, because it's going to put them out to open sea. And so a gentle south wind would have been warm coming up from North Africa, and the day looked pleasant enough as they set out to sea, sailing close by the southern coast of Crete. That's the illusion. Everything always looks good at the beginning. The problem is it did not last long. Paul understood these conditions. Remember, 3 times he had been in a ship and went overboard. This is what the writer Luke has to tell us here in Acts chapter 27. Look at verse 14. But before very long, it didn't take long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Urakilo. See, remember, this is the island, right? And this wind, when it would come up over the island, it would pick up speed, okay? Because it's coming at a high rate of speed, okay? And it hits this little gulf, it hits the island, and then it comes back up, okay? And then it shoots straight down, and it picks up enormous amount of speed. Remember, the island is about 35 miles wide. So it has plenty of time to pick up a violent speed, and now when it comes down, it's going to hit this ship on the other side. This is what this is talking about. There was a fierce wind from the northeast. It comes off of the mountains above Lebanon and blows the cold winter air and harsh blasts across the Mediterranean Sea. This is how far it comes from Lebanon. So that should tell you, okay, the kind of speed this thing is picking up. It was exactly what Paul had predicted would happen. The wisdom of his counsel was now obvious to everybody. It was obvious to all. They understood this. It became now impossible to turn the ship toward Phoenix. And the tempest was so powerful that they had to abandon that as an option. We can't turn around. Can you imagine? This wind is blowing at such a speed, okay, and it's violently is now turning the ship this way, and now you're going to try to turn to this. The problem is that when you try to turn to this thing, it's going to blow this ship right over. Now they're committed in the wrong direction. Look at verse 15 and 16. The scripture says, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. They had no other option. Now they're going out further and further away, running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda. There's another little island out there. We were scarcely able to get the ship's skiff. You know, the skiff is a S-K-I-F-F. It's, you know, the little boat that they usually have in the back of a big ship. Okay, this is where the sailors come down when they come to port. Okay, and they get on the little boat. Okay, it's called a skiff. This little boat, and it only takes a few passengers, and then they come into the port. Okay, meantime the ship stays out. Okay, at the harbor. Okay, well, the problem was that this little boat, okay, is now behind this main ship, and it's just jumping the water everywhere. And the problem is it's about to break up, but worse yet, it's going to pick up and it's going to be slamming against the slats. the wooden slats of the ship. And the ship, the construction of the ship is tongue and groove wood, and it has pitch. It has like this asphalt, okay? That's what keeps it together. However, with the violent wind pounding on it and the waves pounding on it, and now the possibility of this small skiff, this small boat, just banging on this thing, now this is going to create havoc for them. They were now about 25 miles off of Crete. That's how fast. Let me tell you something. They were now 25 miles pushed out at the mercy, and they're clearly at the mercy of the wind. This is what's taking place. Clauda was a small island off the southwestern extremity of Crete. And this little skiff, this little boat, was a wooden dinghy towed by the ship. It was used to do maintenance on the hull and the anchors, and in port it served as a tender, in other words, as a transport, shuttling passengers back and forth to shore. It was the only means they had to get safely to shore when they were anchored in a harbor. It could also serve as a lifeboat, though it would not have been large enough to hold more than a few of the passengers. Apparently, the high winds, right? The skiff, this little boat, was being battered and was in danger of being lost as well. So now they got to make another decision. They just complicated their lives. So they secured the skiff by hauling it up onto the deck. Can you imagine trying to do this in high winds? The ship is rocking back and forth, and you got to get enough men to haul this thing up, okay, without damaging it all, the hull of the ship. Luke, it says himself, the author Luke, who was on this ship himself, apparently helped to do this, as indicated by the use of the pronoun when he says we, because that's what it says, we. Okay? It says at the end of verse 16, running the shelter of a small island called Clauda, notice we were scarcely able to get the skiff's boat under the control. So even Luke was involved in all this. It was all hands were needed in such an emergency, and this thing was getting more difficult. The ship itself was in danger of breaking up, and again, this is what Luke writes. Look in verse 17. Luke says this, after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, and they laid down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. Okay? So what happens is that this thing is now rocking. I mean, this is known as a procedure. It's called frapping. Frapping, F-R-A-P-P-I-N-G. Frapping. Okay? And the hulls of the ship in those days, as I told you earlier, they were assembled together with tongue and groove construction and sealed with this pitch, or what we would call asphalt today. In crashing waves, the slats would be under tremendous amount of stress to begin to pull apart and in danger of coming apart at crucial points. So the cables, actually very large ropes, were passed under the ship and winched together on the deck to hold the whole together. So this is what they would do. So if this was the ship right here, they would throw these ropes down, okay, which meant somebody got to go down there. I mean, do you understand how complicated this is? Do you understand what I'm talking about? And they would have to bring that rope up underneath, okay, and over on the other side, and then they would put a winch, okay, and they would do this, okay, and they would usually, typically, in frapping, there would be somewhere between 15 to 20 ropes. And that's to hold the ship together, okay, to keep it from the tongue and groove slats from coming apart. Do you understand when the captain and the pilot and the centurion made the decision that they were not going to listen to Paul, but they were going to listen to the whole crew and said, let's get going, let's get going, let's get going. We're going to move. We think we can make it. It's only 40 miles. When they made that decision, they had no clue what decision they had made. An equally grave danger was the possibility that they might be blown off course and run aground. Now remember, when they threw the anchor overboard, and they hit the ground underneath the ocean, right? And then what happened was that this anchor's holding them down, and that what they're doing is they're letting the wind to blow them, okay? But they're trying to stay as close as possible to Crete, to the island. Mm-hmm. Now, they're getting blown off course, but they want to stay as close as possible to the island. Mm-hmm. So this thing is dragging underneath, okay? And it's pulling the ship, okay? So you have to understand the amount of force that now those huge chains on that anchor are on the whole of the ship. So this is what this is talking about here. And, okay, so it says in verse 17 again, and after they had hoisted up, that's the skiff, the little boat that they pulled up, and they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, that's the frapping part that I just finished explaining to you. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. Okay? In the New King James Version, at the end of that verse, it says, and they struck sail, and so were driven. In other words, they lower the sails, okay? And so what you do is you lower the sail, right, so that the sail doesn't hold that wind and pushes them out even further. And now you're completely exposed to the winds and to the storm and to the rain. Everything is out there. And now you're hoping that this anchor down underneath the ground doesn't hit a big old rock and get stuck and then just snap this ship apart. That was the kind of decisions that they made. It was poor judgment. Right? So the citrus sands are right outside of the island of Crete. It was a graveyard for ships in the Gulf of Sidra off the African coast west of Cyrene. So that's what it was known as a graveyard back then. The water was shallow with hidden reefs and sandbanks, and so they struck sail, which means they took the sail down. This is what Luke is saying. Look at verse 18 and 19, 27, 18, 19. Now, you had no clue you're ever going to learn this much about sailing, right? What do I know about sailing? I'm a kid from New York City, right? But the scriptures are very clear what it's talking. Why? Because it's talking about judgment. That's what the whole point is. Don't get lost in all the details that I'm sharing with you. It's talking about judgment. Look at verse 18 and 19. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. In other words, it's a fancy word for they started dumping it overboard, okay? And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard in their own hands. You know what that was? That was all their tools, all their equipment. That's what the ship's tackle was. Okay? Everything that Paul had warned about was now actually coming to pass. Lightning the ship involved throwing the cargo overboard. The tackle was their equipment and their tools. That was not a trivial thing, and the decision to do it would not have been made if they had not been in fear of their lives, and they now understood that everything Paul had said was true. Too late. The cargo and the tackle were their livelihood, but they had jettisoned everything and they could get their hands on to allow the ship to ride on a higher waves, okay, so that it wouldn't get swamped by the waves, okay. In other words, it wouldn't go underneath, neither can they hit any of the rocks that are underneath. They wanted to stay as high as possible, which kept them in a possible jettison position. That was the problem with all of these decisions.